Karen, I didn't know if you were going to start. If
Yeah.
you had any introductory remarks?
Excuse me. Sure. Hi, and welcome to Indian Child Welfare Act, History and Present Realities. Thank you for joining us. And if you have questions or comments, please raise them in the Q&A box or the group chat, which can be found at the bottom of your screen. Washington State Bar Association staff are here to support and assist you in your conference experience. This session is being recorded for later replay. And now please welcome Jen Yogi, who will be the moderator for this program.
Thanks, Karen, and welcome everyone. We're glad that you've joined us today for this presentation on the history and present realities of Indian and Native families' experiences with the child welfare system. Some of you may be familiar with the historic widespread removal of Native American children from their families in the context of the Indian Child Welfare Act. And our presenters are going to provide their perspectives on that history and the ongoing impacts of these type of assimilationist government policies on Native communities. I'm going to introduce our speakers in just a moment, but before I do, I wanted to let you know that we're hoping to have some time at the end of the presentation for questions. So feel free to put your questions in the chat and as we go along, and then we'll address some of those later on. And with that, I'm going to introduce our speakers. Rebecca Black is Quileute and an enrolled member of the Quinault Nation. She's a second-generation survivor of the scoop, i.e. forced white adoption. Rebecca speaks truth and lived experience into the importance of the Indian Child Welfare Act. Hers is a story of survival, resilience, and healing. Her survival of forced removal is also what turned her into a grassroots organizer, trainer, speaker, advocate, and tribal foster parent. And Kateri is the Tribal Engagement Manager at Treehouse, an organization that provides academic support and other essential services for youth in foster care. She's a member of the Swinomish tribe and the Halalt First Nation. Thank you so much to both of you for being with us today, and I'm going to turn it right over to you.
Hi everyone, my name is Kateri. As Jen said, I am Swinomish and Halalt, but I'm coming to you from the traditional homelands of the Muckleshoot people. I'm just gonna get my presentation started. So just give me one moment while I do so. Okay. So in this presentation today, we're going to go over, and just for context, this is a 3-hour-long training that we are sharing time for an hour, right? So this is the fastest we could possibly imagine of filling basically generations of and centuries of tragedies and genocide into an hour. So this is going to be our best attempt. For some of you, this might be, some of this might be review. For some of you, this might be the very first time you're hearing some of these truths. And one thing to be really aware of is to take care of yourself. This can be really triggering, especially for a lot of our Indigenous folks that are in the room today. So feel free to take care of yourself if you need to step away. Yeah, Rebecca, is there anything you want to say before we get officially started?
I think that covers it. Just making sure that, especially for our Indigenous folks, that you're mindful of the material that's going to be shared, and just including that all of this can be really triggering for us as Indigenous people.
Thank you. So the objectives of today is to get, like I said, this is the most base level knowledge that we could possibly put into an hour-long training that is typically 3 hours of summarization and could be its own college class in an hour. So we're going to go over just the basic understanding of what tribal sovereignty is, because whenever you're working with tribal folks in general, you are working with nations. Understanding how the boarding school era fed into the scoop era, which then fed into ICWA. So understanding tribal sovereignty. The sovereignty status, tribal sovereignty encompasses Native American military, social, and economic development of Indian nations still remains today. As sovereign entities, Indian nations are guaranteed the power and the right to determine their form of government, define citizenship, make and enforce laws through their police force, courts, collect taxes, and regulate property use. Yet the fight to preserve tribal sovereignty and treaty rights have long been at the forefront of Native American civil rights and civil struggles that are still under attack on a regular basis today. To get like a better understanding of some of the policies that kind of led into ICWA, is better understanding kind of like what sovereignty is as far as a government to government relationship. So American trifederalism involves a constant intersection among national government, the states, and tribal nations. So this slide was something that I'm borrowing from Talina Ives from Tribal Relations at ICWA to better kind of like put a visual understanding of how sovereignty works, right? So if you're looking here, a lot of times people who don't understand what true sovereignty is think that Native tribes are a stakeholder, right? That we're a part of like ICWA or a part of Treehouse or something like that. And that is not accurate. We're not a stakeholder. You understand governments. So a state government like Washington State has the power to create their own set of laws, right? With the understanding that though Washington can enforce their own set of laws within their own boundary lines, someone who goes to Washington State and then is in Oregon State, they then have to follow Oregon State's state laws, and they're not the same, right? They might have similarities, but you cannot enforce one law in a different land. In the same way that the federal government has the ability to create laws and regulations that then could affect Washington State and Oregon State, right? But the United States can't inflict any kind of, or cannot enforce any laws for Canadian folks up in Canada, right? And in the same way, she always brought this up about like how sometimes we kind of forget that, especially in Washington State, there are a lot of like names that are reflections of Indigenous people, right? That cities, this one's a county, so Kitsap County was actually a person. He was Chief Kitsap County, and the reason why Talina put this on a slide is because she is part of that lineage of Kitsap, of Chief Kitsap. But understanding that though there is our federal government can inflict laws pertaining to both Washington and Oregon, and the counties, all counties in Washington State are under the law of Washington State. Our tribal nations are different because they have government to government relationships. Though they might be next to or inside of the borderlines of Washington State, they are their own sovereign nation and have the ability to regulate their people in the same way that any of these other governments have the ability to. So it can be confusing for folks when you go to a tribe on tribal lands, on reservation lands. In Washington State, laws don't apply in the same capacity. They're not enforced in the same capacity because it's a nations to nations regulations. Sorry, that was a little faster than I was expecting. Another important thing is to understand is the Indian Self-Determination Education Act. This allows for government agencies to make contracts of the 386 contracts for tribes to assume administering the funds that appropriate for the people. So basically what this means is before this act of 1975, whenever there was funding that was given by the federal government, it was only the federal government that kind of like had the ability to create these like programs for the tribes. But through the Indian Self-Determination Education Assistance Act, they had the ability to make these contracts where they're getting federal funding, but they had the ability because only folks from the community, only folks who have a deeper understanding of what it's like to live in these spaces know what they need and know how to disperse the money that best affects them, right? I always think of it as if you are working at an agency, right? And then you get your funding from the state, the way in which you disperse the money within an agency is going to be better suited if you are the ones controlling it, as opposed to someone who is at the state, has never been to your agency, has no understanding of how things work or where the actual need is, and they tell you how to like regulate all of the funding. Like, it doesn't make sense. And so this act allowed tribes to make contracts to then do all of the dispersal and being able to create these programs for themselves. Yeah. And this allowed for the tribes to determine their laws for citizenship, for child custody matters, protection and dependency laws per tribal determination. So this is where we're going to switch into kind of the understanding, like, now that we understand some of the laws, we have to understand how some of the laws previously have really impacted tribal people specifically. So understanding the boarding school era is really, really important to just understanding the way in which it flows from the boarding schools to School 60 Scoop and then to ICWA. And like we were saying before, like, just be prepared for this section specifically for all of our Indigenous folks in the room, that it is pretty triggering, and you just want to be really prepared for it. So looking here, this is a list of all the different boarding schools that are just in the United States. This does not include the Canadian residential boarding schools either. So there was over 367 boarding schools in the United States. There's 29 different states that had them. And there are 15 boarding schools still remaining open today. And Washington had 13 alone. I can't remember where I read it, but I remember reading that the Yakama Nation was one of the actual first boarding schools in the country. And then in Canada, they call them residential schools, but it's basically the same idea, that there was 139 in Canada from 1840 to 1997. So like, the reason why we're already putting the dates is because it's really easy to assume when you hear travesties, when you hear cultural genocide and these really oppressive acts, that it was some romantic, really far along gone experience that Indigenous folks once had but are no longer having. And looking by the dates, in Canada, it was 1997 when they stopped having their boarding schools. And in the United States, there are still boarding schools today. A lot of my parents or my father's generation are survivors of the residential schools. So it's not a really long, far gone experience. And something to also think about is some of the findings that we had found at the end. We're going to show a clip about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission up in Canada and First Nations. And to understand that, one, in the United States, we have not had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission except for one in Maine that had to do with Dawnland. There's a documentary called Dawnland that showed about it. But it's only since we've had the first Indigenous Secretary of the Interior that's been appointed, Deborah Halalt, that there has even really been any push to have a study done to find where all of our missing children are here in the United States. I'm sure some of you have found out about the recent uncoverings of the residential schools, primarily up in Canada. And something to really think about is the reason why I say recent uncoverings and not findings or discoveries is because this is information that our elders have been telling us for years, for generations, that they've known about those missing kids for quite some time, but no one has believed them or no one has put any effort forth to find those kids. So earlier this year, the Squat people up in Kamloops Residential School, there was an uncovering of 215 kids. The Coesas people, Maryville, which is in Saskatchewan, there was unmarked graves of 751. And the Palakwan, the Cooper Island Residential School, had 160. And to think about these numbers of the uncoverings, and then to look here and guarantee that all of these boarding schools have funds. All of these boarding schools have children that have not been covered, that are still sitting away from their homelands. I just really want people to understand that so many folks are shocked and shaken about these 3 boarding schools. This is only 3 of 367 in the United States and 139 in Canada. So in Carlisle Indian School, this in the school cemetery, these graves have been marked. Of the marked graves, there's 194. And something that's really important to remember is with each one of these individuals that have gone missing or have gone through these boarding schools and then come home, they're experiencing trauma. And they're experiencing trauma first in the individual experience. People have experienced loss of self-identity because they went from having a good grasp of who they are as part of a community, as part of a family, to being ripped out and sent to a completely different understanding of what identity looks like, or completely different understanding that everything you once knew, your language, your hair, your traditional clothes were all ripped from you. And if you attempted to keep any of those things, you attempted to speak your language, you're physically, which of course would then impact the low self-esteem and a lack of personal safety. As a kid in an institution, because these boarding schools are basically an institution, they're run like military schools. Your adults who were once people who you look to for safety to keep you safe are now the ones that are inflicting pain upon you. So there is no sense of safety anymore. There's a struggle to build healthy relationships because a lot of boarding schools, from stories of elders, is even if they had siblings there, they weren't allowed to interact with them unless they happened to be in the same dormitory. That you should love God before all else, right? And so having that personal connection was supposed to be something that was ripped from you because they didn't want you to feel safe or to feel connected, or because a person who is easily broken, or a person who's broken is easily controlled. So you struggle to build healthy relationships. And then this kind of institutionalization replaces the traditional cultural practices that you once knew. And then it changes the way in which you understand what your parental experiences are, because you no longer have parental relationships, you have disciplinarians or teachers. This is like the same kind of idea where when you've been so regimented and so your every moment is scheduled and your every moment is institutionalized, you kind of have the same experience where if you were attempting to integrate back into a free kind of community, it's a hard transition. It's really similar to somebody who's been in prison for a significant amount of time and then attempting to come home. That transition period is really hard and really challenging. So that is how you have your trauma as an individual level that then bleeds into your understanding of families, because you have then lost your parental connection because you're away for so long. A lot of families were not able to pick up their children, except for like maybe the holidays or maybe summertime if they're lucky and if they could afford to bring their kids home. But this then changes to when you become a parent and having the ability to know how to show love, the ability to know how to parent in a different way than what you've experienced. I mean, that's really challenging to be able to break those cycles, because as a child, if you're unable to experience that kind of parenting on a regular basis, all you ever knew was discipline. It's hard to shift it when you become a parent. there's also this kind of one quote that I heard from an elder was like that she felt like she had a mental block whenever it came to experiencing anything of traditional like language or ceremony, that she was fearful of it because she had always experienced pain whenever she spoke her traditional language. Yeah. And so it also changed just like our traditional child rearing practices, where a lot of communities, you know, may have, or a lot of communities kind of parented or did child rearing in more communal sense, where you have your aunties and your uncles that were kind of helping that family unit. And it shifted the way it changed. So how does that affect our tribal communities, right? So you have your individual that's experienced a trauma. They then come back to their families and they either have a difficult time connecting to their parents, or they're now parents themselves and having to like relearn how to have healthy parenting skills. And it's also, it affects the communities in the sense that like a lot of those ceremonies, a lot of those traditional practices, a lot of the language is lost, because I always think of a quote I heard once that every ceremony, every cultural practice is one generation away from loss. So if you have a mass generation that goes away, is now fearful to continue any of their traditional practices, how much loss there is, because they're fearful of it or they no longer remember because it was ripped from them. And it's really important to think about, like, you know, I think about in the revitalization of what's happening right now, the like language revitalization that's happening right now, and how that in itself is truly a testament of resilience, because for a lot of our tribes, there's very little, or some places no native speakers left of their language, and just trying to like reconnect to it and how important language is to your worldview. I'm definitely just learning. I'm at the very, very basics of learning my language, which is Quileute. And one thing I always think about is just in this very one example, right, is in Quileute, if you're ever going somewhere with somebody, like you say, Jen and I are going to the store, right? Like in English, you say, Jen and I are going to the store. But in Quileute, if there's two people together on the same, they're doing the same thing, the same effort, you say we are going to the store, or they're going to the store. You never differentiate, because why would you need to know the individuals? If they're all collectively doing something, then they're collectively doing something for purpose, right? And how that one, just in that one example, how the worldview of language matters, right? And how much of that is lost. And that's only one example. Languages are so rich. Sorry, going off my own tangent. But then also thinking about like how that affects our tribal nations, right? So when you break it down, and I have to also mention that this was some work that was done by the boarding school healing.org. It's a coalition, or a national coalition. They do amazing work on understanding the impacts of boarding schools. But when you get to your tribal nations, like, it can really break down tribal community. It affects its nations. Not only do you think about all those kids who never made it home, think about their bloodlines. It stopped with them, right? I think about, just for the example of my father. My father is where I get my Swinomish and my Halalt bloodlines from. Through him, and just him, I am one of 6. All of my siblings, except for my oldest and myself, have children. So I have 11 nephews and 2 nieces. And those, and eventually they'll have their own children too, right? And so by each person who is no longer going to be able to make it home, the amount of community that is lost. This is a picture of the Rosebud Youth Council. They had visited Carlisle Boarding School, whose motto, I'm sure most of you know, the Carlisle Boarding School is one of the oldest in the United States. And their motto was to kill the Indian and save the child, or save the man, right? It's this idea that their main purpose was cultural genocide. But this is the Rosebud Youth Council, who took a trip out to Carlisle Boarding School and saw their relatives that were still there, and they wanted to bring them home. And it took 10 years, but that youth council was able to bring them home. And I think it just happened in July. So from my understanding, just the way in which these are the names of the relatives that finally made it home. The first name is the name that was given to them at the boarding school. The second name is what their traditional Lakota name is, translated back into English. And the parentheses would be like their family name. So like the last name idea. And I just want to read the names and welcome them home. So Rose Longface, Little Hawk, Tennis Strikes First, Blue Tomahawk, Maud Little Girl, Sweet Bear, Alvin Kills, 7 Horses, Dora Her Pipe, Blue Bull, Brave Bull, Friend Hollow Horn Bear, Horn Painter, Bear Paints Dirt, Lucy Take the Tail, Pretty Eagle, and Ernest Kicks Off, White Thunder. So through, in the 39 years that Carlisle boarding school was, in 39 years, roughly 7,800 Native children from nearly every tribal nation in the country were forcibly moved and then sent to Carlisle. But through the resilience, through the fight, at least these relatives were able to come home. I'm going to show a video. It is really triggering, just to let you all know. And then after that, we're going to have Becky do her piece and explain kind of how this connection went from boarding schools to the 60s school.
We are here today to remember the Inuit, First Nations, and Métis children who never return home, to share their names and to share the burden of loss that their families continue to carry every day. Today's honor and tribute reminds us that all of the horrors of residential schools are not a distant memory. Many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis alive today knew children who died while in residential school. That is how we keep their memories alive, by learning their stories, learning from them, and sharing them with generations to come.
4,000 plus little ones that didn't come home. In some cases, their parents weren't even notified. In some cases, they're unmarked graves. And so today is the implementation of Call to Action 72, a national memorial register starting to happen so that we never forget. And I've used the word genocide. The residential school system was a genocide of Indigenous peoples, First Nations peoples, forcibly removing children from their homes and inflicting harm and inflicting pain. And we still feel the intergenerational trauma of that genocide. We see it every day in our communities. But now we say there's hope, because it's not just survivors now we want to use, that the people are standing up in this word now, thrivers.
While substantial and unprecedented progress on the path of reconciliation has occurred between the Métis Nation and the Trudeau government over the past 4 years, True and lasting reconciliation cannot and will not occur until Métis residential schools are dealt with, including the Île-à-la-Crosse boarding school.
Canada will not become a really true country until it resolves its relationship with Indigenous peoples in a good way. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the Missing Word Indigenous Women's Inquiry, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, the Truth and Reconciliation Calls to Action, they all call for an improved relationship, one that's built on mutual respect and reciprocity. We don't live in that country yet. We live in a country that still is in the midst of a human rights crisis, profound human rights violations. We've got to do better, and we can do better. And I hope that all Canadians feel that if we get this right, we'll be a better, stronger country.
Thank you, Kateri. The resurfacing of that trauma is reverberating across Indian country right now. And what I am feeling, we collectively are feeling again with the bodies of our young ones and their locations being identified finally. Just needed a minute. So Rebecca Black here. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this piece. I am a second generation scoop survivor, and I'll talk a little bit about that. What happened as the boarding school era was kind of coming to a close, there were some things that were coming to light during that era that didn't shine a good light on a lot of the schools. And so one of the other pieces that they found as well was that we were still together. Like we were still in that setting, we were still gathered at a school together. And that it wasn't as effective as they had hoped. They didn't see the long-term ramifications yet of what it was actually doing to us and to our communities. But we see those effects today, which were the effects that were the goal and the purpose of residential schools. Just 100% put that out there. The other piece is then what the government started looking at, and the BIA included, we're looking at moving into tribal communities as those kids went home from boarding school and became parents, right? As young community members, they went back home. They were really disconnected, as Kateri talked about. Like it was a real struggle to reintegrate into the community. They didn't speak the language anymore. They didn't know their elders. They weren't connected to their family. And yet they were just sent home, just like getting let out of prison. It's like, oh, here you go. Here's your 10 cents and bye-bye, right? And so those students that did survive and that did make it home, then married or partnered and started having families. So then the next wave of that institutional racism that comes at us in our tribal communities was the Indian adoption projects. Here in Washington State, the BIA funded the Indian adoption projects. And what we in tribal communities talk about as the scoop era, which meant that literally old time DCYF, right, and Catholic Charity Services, you know, those kinds of agencies, were encouraged, supported, and paid to come into our tribal communities and literally scoop as many kids off the reservation as they could. Like literally scoop them into cars and take them. Some of you may know Ramona Bennett. Like she and I have sat, you know, the Mother of ICWA and the Slayer of Dragons have sat for long periods of time talking about that era. And when she was young, she remembers going to Quileute. I'm Quileute by my matriarchal line, but I am enrolled Quinault. And going to La Push to our community for ceremony, and there were no children. There were no children between the ages of 4 and 15. And my mother, Karen Myrtle Black, was one of those children that was taken. This was in 1949. And so sometimes people put kind of an age span or a year span on the scoop, but it really started in the late 40s when they could get away with it, and moved all the way through, like was still sanctioned and supported through the 80s. And so, and it really hasn't stopped. It just has a new name, right? We call it foster care. And so my mother was taken in 1949 from the streets of La Push and taken really quickly to Clown County into Port Angeles. And my would have been my great grandma, my mom's grandma, went to court to regain custody of her grandchildren and was denied. My grandmother, my mom's mother, also went to court and was denied. They were both deemed morally unfit to raise my mother. No other explanation was given and no other explanation was needed. And the gavel came down and they loaded my mother and her siblings in a car and they took them to an orphanage at Cushman, right? Those buildings often transferred into other holding facilities for our people, and to an orphanage where, so think about it, it's 1949. There's not a lot of money. La Push is a really remote community. Not everyone has cars or disposable income to search and try, because they don't tell you where they're taking your children. What do you do as an Indigenous mother? Let's say you came home today from work and your children aren't home. And you think, what? Where are my kids? Oh, so sorry. They're not coming home. They were taken today. Taken for what? Basically because they were Indigenous children. I have friends today that are only a couple years older than me who at Swinomish, when they were going to school, remember their mom say they weren't allowed to wear white t-shirts with their jeans, you know, back in the 60s, 50s and 60s, and everybody, you know, with the white t-shirts, and that they weren't allowed to do that. And their mother told them, son, you can't wear a white t-shirt to school because they will take you if you get dirty at school. So there was no rhyme or reason, but that's like someone that's a couple years older, like went to high school with me. And he remembers his mother telling him that. I've sat with elders at Swinomish that have said, don't you remember, that close to my age group that said, don't you remember like having a plan of what window you were supposed to go out in our house if a black car pulled up or the police pulled up with a black sedan? And we knew what window to go out, and we knew where we were supposed to stay, regardless of whether or not our parents got arrested. We were not to come out of the woods. We were to stay there until those people left. And these are current day stories. So my mother is taken really quickly to Cushman. She's old enough to know that she's not an orphan. And she's adopted really quickly out of state. She was advertised in a magazine. They had commercials for us. Wouldn't you take in one of these poor Indian waifs who no one wants and no one can raise? You know, all of which was propaganda and not true. And my mother was adopted really quickly into Oregon. The other piece of that, when we're adopted, of course, they change your birth certificate. Literally change your birth certificate. So you may have the same birth date, but you legally on your birth certificate is a different name. She is now out of state. She knows she's different from her parents, but she doesn't know where her home is. And yet she knows that she has people. The home was very abusive. Even statistically today, tribal adoptions into white families fail a huge percentage of the time, because good white saviorism doesn't support the indigenous. Like, we talk about how our Indian knows that we have people and that we have community, and our Indian longs to go home. It doesn't matter how old you are. And so my mother is surviving this really abusive, horrible adoption. There's no follow-up. There still isn't today. You adopt somebody and all right then. And so my mother's suffering some really terrible abuse in this home. And one of the other pieces too around the boarding school, Kateri, to just add to your piece, that kids were, because it was so far away, and parents often, one, didn't know where they were, and two, didn't have money to travel or to facilitate bringing them home. Boarding schools farmed us out for cheap labor. So for $10, and sometimes just for room and board, in the summer, they would farm us out for like basically for slavery and chattel slavery, right? You would be an indentured servant in this white home where atrocities happened and children died and were never recorded when they didn't come back from those homes where they were sent for indentured servitude. And so my mother in Oregon now, and it's the 60s, and she gets pregnant with me. And now the white couple are embarrassed. My gosh, we took in this Indian girl. Now she has the audacity to embarrass us, and she's pregnant. And they sent her away to Catholic. They still had them. I'm sure you can probably still find them today. A Catholic-run girls' home, where she suffered even further abuse, physical abuse and assault while she was there, and got ready to give birth to me. They brought forms. My mother didn't read well. They brought forms to her and they said that she needed to sign them, and it was just about, she didn't need to worry about it. It was just about the care of her baby. And she signed them and they took the papers away. And she went into labor with me, and I was born, and they took me out of the room. And my mother said, "Where's my baby? I want to hold my daughter." And the nuns informed her that she had signed voluntary adoption papers, and that she would never see me and she would never hold me. And she was never allowed to, and I was gone. And I too was put up for adoption I lived in foster care for about 5 years. I was advertised in a magazine because now I'm getting a little older and the state's like, well, I don't know, we got to do something with these brown kids that aren't being adopted. And so I was advertised in a catalog, and my white adoptive parents saw me, and the social worker in Oregon told them, well, if you don't mind a little older child, and she's Indian, so but you wouldn't have to wait as long for a white baby if you wanted to take one of these kids. And that's how they decided that they would adopt me. In the meantime, my mother ran away from that school, and she never went home to the people who adopted her. She was really young. She didn't have an education. And she spent a lot of the remainder of her life living on the streets of Portland and Seattle. And so now I'm adopted into this white family who knows nothing, right, about my culture or about, they know I'm Indian, but, beyond that, not much. And so they also are very abusive. I was treated, they were physically and spiritually and emotionally really abusive. And I ran away at 13 because I knew, again, in our communities, we talk about my Indian knew that these were not my people. And by the grace of my ancestors, we at that time were living at Swinomish. Not within the tribal community, but within the reservation. And I knew at that time at 13, these are my people. They may not be my people, but these are my people. And I ran away. I couch surfed. I lived on, thank God, the generosity of our tribal communities, of people who take us in and know. And a family took me in, and I lived with them for several years. But I became an emancipated youth. I never spoke to them again. Again, another failed adoption. And I know all of these things because I was able to locate my mother when I had a daughter of my own, because I knew that we needed to be connected. I knew that needed to happen, and I started searching for her. And so all of those things, none of the things that I had been told my entire life in white adoption were true. So when I say that I'm not only a second generation scoop survivor, but I'm also a survivor of forced white adoption, because there was nothing consensual about it. And this happens to our people and to our women. If you watch the film Dawnland, there are women on there talking about the social workers pressuring them when they were pregnant, coming to their house, knocking on their door, trying to take them to dinner to talk to them about, well, you just need to give up this baby because you can't take care of them. And there's a rich white couple that could give them everything that they need. And which is the narrative that I was told, that my mother didn't want me, that my community didn't want me, that my people, didn't know that I existed, that they didn't want me either. All of those things that are told to us in that adoption narrative, especially for BIPOC folks, are often not true. Because really what it was that the structural and institutional racism and genocidal policies are what put me into the system for adoption. And I know we're short on time, but the piece that's really important to think about today with the children and the that you're dealing with today in the foster care system, because I am now a tribal foster parent, state licensed. I didn't have to do that. I could have went through any of our nations and become a tribal foster parent, but I wanted to see what the state was actually doing, because they were saying they were doing all of these things around ICWA and working on being more compliant, since we're the 6th worst state in the nation for ICWA compliance, I might add. I thought, I want to go through the state process because I want to see what that looks like. And so I did that. I am raising 2 amazing kiddos that came to me through a tribal agency. They did not come to me through the state. So I've been licensed for 6 years as a state licensed tribal foster home. I'm a single auntie. How many times do you think the state, the shiny new penny of DCYF, in 6 years, how many times do you think the state has called me for an ICWA compliant federal law compliant placement in the center of Coast Salish territory? I am in the middle of everything as far as Coast Salish goes. How many times do you, just somebody put in the chat, how many times do you think DCYF has called me for an ICWA compliant placement into a tribal home? Yeah.
A lot of zeros. No one.
Full of zeros.
Not enough.
0. Absolutely 0. 0. Any children that have come to me are because we as Indigenous people know each other, and people at tribal agencies know that I am a licensed foster parent. The 2 boys that I have now, a boy transitioned home out of my care, like that next day, they were at my office in Swinomish and said, "Hi, so we heard you might have an opening in your home." And I was like, "What?" None of the respite, none of that has ever come to me through DCYF. So, y'all, we have a lot of work to do when we're talking about ICWA and, you know, federal law. And I know that we in Washington State like to pride ourselves, right, on being this crunchy granola, progressive, democratic state. Okay, we're the 6th worst state in the nation for ICWA compliance. And we are worse, we are rated for compliance worse than the Dakotas. And look how that lawsuit went for all of you in the legal field, right? And what that the state is going through for their non-compliance and for their racist, just this systematic and systemic, racism that is built into their child welfare system. Well, we don't get to sit here in Washington and say that we're a whole lot better. I work with the National Indian Child Welfare Association on a regular basis in Portland. They did a short film about my story. But I'm in close communication with them on a regular basis. And I can tell you that Washington isn't any better than, we're actually ranked worse than the Dakotas. So we have a lot of work to do. And I'll close with this. That piece, when they were talking about reconciliation in Canada, like I'm here to tell you, with the genocidal policies that I have survived in this country, I've testified before the Department of Justice. I've testified before Kevin Washburn when he was at the helm still of the BIA. And I straight up told him to his face, I hold you responsible for the early death of my mother. I hold you responsible. And that piece about reconciliation is, I don't have a relationship to reconcile with y'all. Tribal nations in this country you have never built an actual honest nation-to-nation relationship with us to reconcile to. So let's hear some truth. Let's start removing, we're talking about anti-racism. Let's start removing the racist and genocidal policy within our child welfare system that it's built on, the foundation that it is built on Let's dismantle that. Let's start being in compliance with ICWA. Let's change the standing of the state of Washington, and let's move into, for the first time ever within our child welfare system, a relationship with the 29 nations that are in our state. How about we start there? And then we might have a relationship to build on. But right now, I don't have a relationship to reconcile with. I think I'll just end right there.
Thank you so much to both of you. Wow, I'm pretty much speechless. But I do want to give people an opportunity to, if you have questions, this is just an amazing panel. And if you do have any questions, we can try to address those. I've seen there's been a lot of comments and engagement with the discussion in the chat, but I don't think I've seen questions yet. Yeah, I mean, people are just really voicing the powerful words that you guys have shared with us, and it's okay. Sorry, there is a question. Wondering if you have recommendations for this is from Sina, from non-Native service providers who are doing outreach to Native communities who may be reluctant to do that outreach out of fear of traumatizing or offending Native communities. Do you have thoughts about how to approach that work in a way that that's
like, I'm just going to be honest with, and this is just my personal opinion from my own lived experience and from living in a tribal community, and the intergenerational and historical and current trauma that are created by organizations who come into our communities, is that you don't. You hire an Indigenous person who's culturally responsive to our people and our communities and understands our historical trauma, and you pay them what they're worth, and you allow them to come into our communities. Because until some of these systems change and start having accountability and doing the things in a culturally relevant way, you are going to be offensive. You are going to step on toes. You are going to, and so being able to create those within white organizations, Indigenous, just like Kateri, right? Finally, Treehouse realized, like, we're dealing with a lot of tribal kids at Treehouse, and we don't know how to do that well, right? So organizations need to start recognizing that they can't in a good way. DCYF disbanded their only tribal licensing program because we didn't need it. We're fine. Any of our licensors can go into a tribe. We don't need that. That's just extra. And then they wonder why they don't get any kind of leverage within our communities. I'll tell you why. Because you're offensive, you're racist, you're judgmental. You come into our communities in a really just offensive way. And then you wonder why we don't come and sit down with you at the table, right?
I don't know if this is, sorry, go ahead, please, Kateri. So,
as Becky is referring to, I'm a tribal engagement manager at Treehouse, which is a non-tribal organization attempting to work with tribal communities. As a tribal person, attempting to be that liaison between the two, it's not easy. And it doesn't start with the fact that, like, I got this position first. It starts with the fact that I already had relationships within these communities to begin with. The most important thing to begin with when you're an outside person attempting to work with communities, even as an Indigenous person, if it's not my tribe, I'm still an outside person. Is remembering relationship is the most important thing, and relationships aren't built in a day. They're not built in one meeting. They're not even built in a month. They're built through years of showing up, of coming off clock hours, of coming to community events because you were asked to, coming to a community events because you asked them if it was okay for you to be there first, and then once getting permission, going. It's built in understanding that sometimes you have to be the buffer as the Indigenous liaison to like a non-tribal organization to say, like, I don't actually trust you all, even though you're my supervisor, I don't trust you and all to be in this meeting. I will take care of it. And once whoever it is, whatever tribe I'm working with, whichever Indigenous person I'm working with, once I feel like I have prepped my team enough to not be offensive, then, and through the ability of allowing our tribal folks to be the ones to determine the pace in which we come, then you're allowed to meet them.
All that.
We are at time. I'm sorry we didn't have time to answer more of the questions in the chat, but we really appreciate the level of interest and engagement. And thank you again so much to Rebecca and Kateri for your presentations today. That was amazing.